So I'm Blair McKenzie. I'm a simple soil scientist. I'm not an agricultural engineer. I'm certainly not an economist. But I am going to have to come out of my comfort zone today and talk about some economics. It's not something I'm comfortable with. For the reason that I'm not comfortable with it, I'll make sure that you all have access to all the data that the economics are based on at the start. The report, a lot of what I'm talking about today has come out of long-term project work that was funded under the platform's title, and it's on the AHDB website. So if you ask me what depreciation was used on some piece of kit, I won't know, but I'll be able to say to you, you can always look it up on the document that's there. Got to be careful where I stand, don't I? So I want to take a couple of things first. First of all, as a soil scientist, we know what we want about our soils. We want them to be soft. We want them to be stable. We want them to allow roots to penetrate. Obviously, that's where the plant's got to take up its nutrients from. We know we've got to drain excess water. We know we want to hold the water and nutrients that we need. We don't want them contaminated. We want them to have good biology. We want them to cycle organic matter, but store organic matter and nutrients. We want them free from pests, free from diseases. We're asking quite a bit, aren't we, really? We're asking our soils to do a lot. And they do, but we do need to look after them to do that. I didn't do this talk here 3 years ago, but elsewhere I did. The talk that I did 3 years ago, it was done 3 years ago, I think my colleague Ken Loades did it up here, was to talk about managing tram lines in arable systems. And we talked about the benefits of using low-pressure tyres to minimise the risk of erosion. Now that photo's from Aberdeenshire, not last winter, the winter before, which some of you will remember was a fairly wet winter, but we can see the consequences of the erosion that goes on by not managing our tram lines. And part of that's because we get compaction under tyres. And this is a simple diagram which says, okay, if the tractor is coming along this way, what happens? The soil starts here. When the front tyre of the tractor pushes the soil forward, it actually rises up a bit. As the weight comes on, the soil is pushed down, then slips back to the original spode. And when the weight comes off, it comes back part way up, but not to where it was originally. And obviously, as the main tyre comes on, the main weight. So we have the problem of compaction. And we know, again, from previous research, that there are problems of compaction. All our machinery is getting bigger. The weights are the axle loads are increasing, be it our combines, be it our tractors, be it our whatevers. And so we know we've got a problem that we don't have necessarily the soft soil that I talked about in that last slide. So I want to come on to where I'm talking about now and going and the work that I want to talk about today is a combination of work that's been funded. It's been funded particularly by AHDB. There was a potatoes component to it, but I'm talking today almost exclusively about the cereals component of it. But it used a number of long-term experiments. And those long-term experiments have had ongoing funding, both from the Scottish Government and from the NIAB, from DEFRA, and from a number of charitable trusts. And one of the things that was common to the different sites was they compared a ploughed system with a non-inversion system. So cultivation, ploughed, and non-inversion. There were all sorts of bells and whistles on different ones. Sometimes the ploughed had extra bits of something happening to it, but that's basically a lot of the comparisons that were made. Some had more varieties, some had bigger areas, and so we made some comparisons. So there were a couple of sites in Scotland and a couple of sites in the east of England that we were able to use. The site that I'll start talking about is in Mid-Pilmore at James Hutton, just on the outskirts of Dundee. And the plots there are small. They're what Claire would say were too small. They're 6 metres by 1 metre. But they allowed us to try lots and lots and lots of different varieties. So it's barley continuous. Whereas the other sites the STAR site, which is Sustainability Trial for Arable Rotations in Norfolk, and the NFS one in Suffolk, are large scale. They're using real machinery and they're using real rotations. As is the Centre for Sustainable Cropping at Balruddery, just out of Dundee. But I'll start talking about I'll take data in the first instance from all of them. And the question that we came up with was, are we managing to store more carbon under a no-till system, or under a non-inversion system, or under a ploughed system? Do we see differences in accumulation of carbon? So we go first to, this is mid-Pillmore, and this is depth. So this is the surface, and we go deep, and this is the amount of carbon. And we can see there's some bells and whistles, but basically we're seeing that under the non-inversion systems, we're not accumulating at that site, under continuous barley, any more carbon in the soil than under the ploughed system. The ploughed system actually can be doing marginally better at accumulating soil carbon. If we go to the sustainability trial for arable rotation, which is a rotation experiment, no real differences. There's perhaps some small differences nearer the surface, but they're not particularly great. If we go to the NFS, the New Farming Systems trial, yes, there's some accumulation under their non-inversion, their deep non-inversion system, but it's a bit offset by further down the profile. So the first comment out of this, even though it's not where we had a little bit of absolute no-till under continuous barley, there was no increase in soil carbon, but even where we've had larger scale, real machinery, non-inversion versus ploughed systems, we're not seeing accumulation of carbon. So it's not necessarily what I wanted to be saying, but if we want to be storing more carbon in our soils, then going to a shallow non-inversion system isn't, from this evidence across the UK, isn't managing to deliver it. Where we are seeing increases in carbon is in the Balrudry site, where we've been applying compost. We've been applying organic matter, extra organic matter going on, and that is staying in the soil, and we are seeing some benefits of that in terms of, for example, the stability of the soil, how well the soil will hold together. So we can change the carbon status of the soil, but from what we've seen in the UK, we're not seeing it as a result of going to non-inversion systems. That's not what the Americans are saying, but it is, interestingly, what places like Finland are saying. The Finns have found some similar sorts of data. They're not seeing accumulations of carbon under non-inversion systems. So the Americans are different. We're in a different environment, but we're saying our results are consistent across the UK and consistent with elsewhere in Europe. So I want to talk briefly now about mid-Pillmore. And mid-Pillmore is, as I say, a small plot experiment. 3 years of identical varieties, some wacky ones, some normal varieties, replicated plots, lots of genotypes, and the site had been under continuous barley, and that causes problems, I accept that, because continuous spring barley for 10 years or more isn't a normal rotation. We did have a no-till system in there, but after 10 years, it's not surprising that 10 years of continuous barley under no-till, we started having weed problems and we had to stop that one. So the comparisons are under various ploughed systems and a non-inversion or a min-till system. What do we see in response of yield? So these are a whole range of varieties. These are yields, and I say these are done on small plots. So they treat the yields as relative. I know you guys would all do much better yields than this every year, always. But what we've got is small plots, so we can make comparisons. And the interesting thing is we've got 3 basically ploughed systems and a non-inversion system. And we see that in general, the ones that do better under a ploughed system generally tend to do better under min-till systems. But we can explore that a bit more if we plot those data slightly differently. Right. So this is not geared by maximum yield. This is geared by how much difference. So these ones have the biggest difference, this end, the biggest difference between the yield under plough and under min-till. And down here are the ones where there's no difference between the yield under a non-inversion system and a ploughed system. So we can see that there are some that do pretty well under all systems, and there are some where, even though they're the really high yielding ones, under ploughed systems don't necessarily do so well under non-inversion systems. And that causes us to ask a few questions. And the gentleman earlier today asked the question about having varieties suitable for conditions up here. So the question that this raises is, what are they, if you're moving to non-inversion systems, are the varieties right? In general, we're seeing better yields, so that's a good thing. So in general, the non-inversion yields were lower than the inversion yields in every year. So we were seeing under our systems, small plot scales and treating as relative, we were seeing the non-inversion yields were lower. In general, the highest yielding cultivars under non-inversion tended to be better yielding under ploughed. So if you're picking a variety on no other information, a high yielding one under plough is likely to be pushing the system. The point I didn't make, I should have made back here, is this one here that's yielding pretty well and very close to under all conditions yielding well is actually concerto. And maybe that's, I know it's now a well-gone variety, but anecdotally people have said it's performed well over long years under different sorts of conditions and years. The recommended lists, and I accept that in general the recommended lists are pointing us in the right direction, but all the selection is being done under ploughed systems, I think. Somebody will throw something in if I'm wrong. So the question is, do we need to be evaluating, at least to some extent, some of the new varieties, not only under ploughed systems, but under min-till, no-till systems? And would we be getting, in general, would we be getting similar winners, but would we be getting absolutely the same winners under different conditions? We did lots of work, and there's lots of people been involved in this, and I can't cover what's all in a 176-page report. We looked at the soil chemistry, and the one thing we did find under the zero-till and the shallow non-inversion systems was there was some accumulation of nutrients in the surface, but we also got acidification in the surface. And so a general comment, and it's perhaps not, again, rocket science, that we get accumulation of nutrients when we're not inverting the soil. We get accumulation of nutrients in the surface, which is where the roots are and most of the biology is, I suppose. But that does mean for things like acidification, where we're getting acidifying conditions in the surface, because we're not inverting, we're not mixing the soil, it's something that would need to be managed and needs to be thought about. I want to talk now, and this is where I've got to come out of my comfort zone and be an economist a bit, about a long-term experiment run in, I think it's Norfolk, no, this one's Suffolk. Sustainability trial for arable rotations run by NIAB, Ron Stobbart, who was at NIAB and has now gone to Sainsbury's, and Nathan Morris particularly played it. And they have a range of rotations, 4 different rotations, and different crop establishment techniques. They have a winter, a spring, a continuous wheat and alternate fallow, and they have what they call a managed approach. Basically, when this was set up more than 10 years ago, they had the approaches, and then they had a committee that said, well, hang on, we want to be able to vary something. If there's something that we really think needs to change, if we've got a particular problem that we need to respond to, we want to be able to respond to it. So I won't go into all the details, but it's a properly replicated experiment done with farm-scale machinery, and you can see it's been running since 2006. So we've had time for the conditions to establish. If you're going under non-inversion tillage or whatever it is, you've had time for conditions to establish. And so these were done on real scale, and again, Ron did all the economics, I didn't, but we can then start to make some comparisons about yield and about performance. If I've got this right. So these are long-term yields relative to the plough. So all these figures that I'll put up are yields or margins relative to the ploughed system, to the crop establishment by ploughing. And under the different rotations, a winter rotation, a spring rotation, the continuous, and the alternate fallow, which was wheat fallow, wheat fallow, wheat fallow. And we can see that in general, the yields of the plough were as good as if not better, than most of the others. When you start bringing in some of the economics, and these are not 1 or 2 years, these are multiple years, these are 8 or 9 years of margin, we can see that switching the brain on and responding to challenges does give us some benefits in terms of margin. Obviously, things like the alternate fallow, where there's only a crop every other year, the margins are much down. But the non-inversion deep ploughing, because the costs are lower, can also be quite productive. Now, that's over multiple years. I can't give you the figures on how the depreciations were worked out or any of those sorts of figures, but they're in that report. The other big experiment they had, which is the one in, if I've got them around the right way, Norfolk, was the new farming systems. Again, it's on a large-scale machinery, and again, a long-term. This wasn't only established until 2008, which must be getting close to 10 years ago, and rotation. And we can see similar sorts of results here for ploughed, managed, a deep and a shallow non-inversion, and we can see relative margins. And again, the deep non-inversion and the managed approaches are coming out in terms of profitability over multiple years, are doing quite well. So I just note that I'll come back to this, the NFS system has some cover crops, which I'll mention in a minute. So overall, the long-term trends in yield and margin from those two experiments, and I accept those two are in England, but are coming out, the margins, the deep non-inversion systems are coming out probably marginally in front because we've got some lower costs in there. So again, it wasn't perhaps what I expected at the start of these things 10 years ago, and some of these experiments are ongoing and we continue to gather data. I want to just, as I said, the NFS system has had a cover crop element in it. So the question was asked, are we seeing benefits to the subsequent crop for the cover crops? Now, these are English conditions, so they can plant their cover crops a lot earlier and get them in before their spring crops. And you'd say on the figures of this, no cover crop, not much difference in yields and not much difference in margins. When we start teasing that out a little bit more, if we look at, I'll go back 2 things. I'll just say, remember 2014 we had oilseed rape in the system. So we've got the cover crops, we're not seeing automatic benefits of the cover crops in these conditions. When we separate out the benefits, or disbenefits if you like, if that's a word, it's sort of a word an economist would use, isn't it, a disbenefit? Under a ploughed system we see quite a lot of the years there is absolutely no benefit, or there's a negative as a result of the cover crops, and only the 1 year where there is. Under the non-inversion systems, more often we see a benefit, a positive, as a result of having that cover crop in. The one time we didn't see a benefit of having a brassica cover crop was the year before the oilseed rape. So the responses to cover crops under English conditions will depend, and the consequences of the cover crops, the benefits or disbenefits will depend on what sorts of cultivation systems and how they fit into a rotation and a production system. I just want to come on to a couple of things. So one of the questions, and I got involved in the Fife Monitor Farm up here, the guys at the Fife Monitor Farm asked questions about, well, can we even establish winter, or can we get cover crops established after harvesting spring barley or something, and have an overwinter? So can we get them established? Could we get them, would the soil come March be wetter or drier? Obviously they were thinking perhaps if it's drier it might be easier to cultivate come March. Will they help prevent erosion? Will they contribute to organic matter? Will there be more slugs? Will there be more earthworms? These sorts of questions. So we set up, and in conjunction with Kings, who provided the seed gratis, and that was a big help to being able to, on realistic scale. So we set up a replicated experiment where the strips are about 200 metres long and 6 metres wide, and 6 metres wide's the width of our combine. So we've got decent cover crops, and we established the cover crop and then had spring barley, put the cover crop in and then had spring barley. Same cover crops and a range of cover crops in the same places. This slide doesn't come up as well as I hoped it might. But these are the barley yields following cover crops, and the yield in tonnes, and they're much more like they should be. There's the yield in 2016 for spring barley following no cover crop, just leaving the soil as stubble, and there's the yield for 2017. If we looked at the same replicated experiment, the strips that had the oil radish in them, there's the yield for spring barley for 2016, and there's the yield for 2017. Because of the variability, it's not quite statistically significant. But I'd say there's some strong encouragement that even under ploughed systems, we can establish the cover crops, and there's some suggestion that they are giving us some benefits. There's a range of cover crops in here, and those data are coming out. I'm conscious of time here. So there's a couple of comments about it. There is some evidence of drying, that the soil's a bit drier having had the cover crop in March, which isn't surprising. It's used some water and dried the soil, maybe made it a bit easier to work. The differences in earthworms and slugs have so far been minor. There's no real difference. We are seeing surrogates erosions. That erosion I talked about in the first, having the cover crop will take up the water and will slow down overland flow and can help control erosion. We talked about the benefits to following crop. What I want to just briefly mention is, are there benefits of the cover crops to organic matter in the soil? We can talk about organic matter as just being a gross amount of organic matter or carbon. We can also start to think about what the quality of that organic matter is. And a colleague at James Hutton uses a system, Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. Sounds fancy. All it does is takes the soil, you take the soil back to the lab usually, or you could do it in the field occasionally, and you put some energy into the system. And the molecules vibrate and bend and stretch depending on how much energy you put into them. If you stop putting the energy in, they generally relax and they give off a spectrum. And this is the sort of spectrum you get. And the spectrum you get depends on the minerals in the soil and the organic matter in the soil. So the red line, and obviously some of these things show that the minerals, whether under a cover crop or under no cover crop, were the same. It was the same field, so we didn't expect many differences. But where we've had the cover crops, we do see some slight differences in the organic matter. And Jean Robertson, who's done this work, my colleague from James Hutton, notices that this peak here, if she's doing Fourier transform infrared, she says that spectral wave number often corresponds, if she's analysing grain or something, that's the wave number that she would find protein at. She would expect to see protein there. So we're suggesting that perhaps we're not only thinking about changing the amount of organic matter, we're changing the nature of the organic matter. And perhaps we're seeing a bit more protein in the soil organic matter, and so perhaps we'll get more muscular earthworms or something like that as a result. But it may be the organic matter with more protein will have other functions. So it's not just carbon, it's the organic matter, and we need to think about it. So very briefly, I'll return to the discussion, the comments about Mid-Pillmore. These are data from Dundee, 2011-12, over winter, December, February, we had 108 millimetres of rainfall, which was about the 57th, out of 62 years, it was about the 57th wettest. So it was a dry winter. 2012-13 was a wet one. It came in at 276 millimetres, and 2013 was another wet one. They were about 4 and 6 on our all-time wettest years. None of the years were cold, and we were going out with a colleague, Bruce Ball from SRUC, and looking at the soil under this experiment, this plot experiment, and trying to make some evaluations of the quality of the soil. Doing things like just pushing a rod in, a penetrometer into soil, and seeing how far we could get it in before the soil got too hard to push the rod in. So that money, the work we were doing then ran out, and we couldn't do anything in 2014-15 winter. Partly the no-till experiment, part of it had stopped and other things had stopped. But then we got 2015-16, and I talked about the start, the erosion problem, and 2015-16 we had 380 millimetres over that period, which was by far and away the wettest winter we've ever had in 62 years of records. Stands out way and above. So we thought, well, we better go out. And these measurements, we go out and do some soil measurements in May, as all the other measurements have been done. We're going out after the crop's been sown and looked at what the soil quality indicators are after dry winter, a couple of wet winters, and one extreme winter. And these are data for just how far you can push a probe into the soil, push a metal rod into the soil before it gets hard. And it doesn't matter whether you're under no traffic and some grassed environments or normal, or where you've got extra traffic, or whether you had min-till or even plough till. Even under any of these conditions, if you come along in May and look at the soil where you've had the extremely wet winter, you can't get the rod in as far. The soil's slumped. It's got that anaerobic condition has had an effect. And so it's not surprising. It's waterlogging, having waterlogged fields, denatures the organic matter, slumps the soil, creates anaerobic. You get all those horrible smells from very wet soil, all those things that you know about, denatures the organic matter, and so causes problems. So it reminds me that we need to keep thinking about, under any of these cultivation systems, making sure that our drainage is good, that we don't have waterlogged, saturated soil. If the soil froze, that might be different, but we're not getting certainly in Dundee, we haven't had the freezing conditions that we have had sometimes. So some general conclusions. We're not seeing accumulation of organic matter in the soil under no-till or min-till conditions. We need to think about matching our varieties, not only to Aberdeenshire conditions, but under the sorts of tillage systems that you're using. If everyone's using ploughed systems, that's fine. But if more and more people are moving to no-till, min-till systems, then we need to start thinking about picking the genetics, the varieties to match those conditions. We know from other work that the soils, because of the weights of machinery, the soils are getting hard. And again, I didn't put up all the data, but they're in the report, that in general, if we look at soil conditions under the shallow non-inversion systems, under the reduced tillage systems, the conditions perhaps tend to be a bit poorer at the start of the season, but probably get better later in the season. And we need to consider those weather conditions to think about, can we stop the soil being waterlogged? There's lots of people, I think I've got most people, there's probably others I should thank. Lots of colleagues, lots of people at NIAB, Struck, King Seeds. I've taken money from commercial company, I admit it. I'm quite happy to do that. AHDB have been great, but so have the Scottish Government, and they've allowed us to have these long-term experiments where we can come in and ask the extra questions. Thank you.